Dr. Cathcart, a man interested in the human mind, returned from a hunting trip without a trophy but with a remarkable experience. He was accompanied by his nephew, Simpson, a divinity student, and two guides, Hank Davis and Joseph DeFago, a French-Canadian with unparalleled knowledge of woodcraft and bush lore. They were joined by Punk, an Indian who acted as their cook. The group was despondent after a week without finding any moose, and DeFago's story was interrupted by Hank's criticism. As they sat around the fire, Hank suggested breaking new ground the next day, and Dr. Cathcart agreed. DeFago was assigned to take Simpson across the lake and explore the southern shore, but he seemed reluctant and scared. Hank tried to reassure him, but Dr. Cathcart noticed a flash of fear in DeFago's eyes. As they settled in for the night, Punk listened in on their conversation, and Dr. Cathcart sensed that something was amiss. In the stillness of the wilderness, a man stood motionless, his senses heightened as he sniffed the air. He was a wild man with a deep connection to nature. As he slept, a change in the wind brought a faint, unfamiliar odor that stirred unease in the French-Canadian and the man of Indian blood. In the morning, the camp was alive, and Hank, Cathcart, and DeFago set out on their journey. Simpson, a young man, was enchanted by the austere beauty of the wilderness. He and DeFago paddled across the lake, their canoe dancing on the water. As they journeyed deeper into the uninhabited regions, Simpson felt overwhelmed by the sense of his own littleness. DeFago, a symbol of civilization, stood between him and death by exhaustion and starvation. They reached 50 Island Water, a large sheet of water dotted with pine-clad islands. As the sun dipped, DeFago went off to search for moose, leaving Simpson alone in the forest. The young man felt a mix of pleasure and alarm at his isolation. As they sat by the fire, DeFago spoke of the wood's vastness, saying, "There's no end to 'em, no end at all." Simpson sensed a gravity in his tone, a hint of the strange fever of the wilderness that could drive men to their death. In the vast wilderness, Simpson and his guide, DeFago, hunted for game. Simpson was fascinated by the scale of the land, but DeFago's eerie behavior soon caught his attention. While singing a voyageur song, DeFago suddenly stopped and sniffed the air, his face turning white with fear. Simpson felt uneasy, but DeFago downplayed the incident, saying he was just taking a look around. As they sat by the fire, DeFago's attempts to hide his fear only made things worse. Simpson sensed that something was amiss, but he couldn't quite put his finger on it. The guide's visible terror and strange behavior hinted at an unknown horror lurking in the forest. As the night wore on, Simpson tried to brush off the feeling of unease, attributing it to the wild scenery and his own imagination. However, DeFago's whispered words about the Wendigo, a mythical creature said to roam the woods, sent shivers down Simpson's spine. The two men retired to their tent, but the darkness outside seemed to press in on them. Simpson couldn't shake off the feeling that they were being watched, and the sound of lapping water outside the tent door was soon replaced by an ominous, unidentifiable noise. In the vast wilderness, Simpson and DeFago, a guide, were camping together. One night, DeFago suddenly started sobbing, and Simpson tried to comfort him. After a while, DeFago calmed down, but Simpson couldn't shake off the feeling of unease. As he drifted off to sleep, he was unaware of the terror that was to come. In the early dawn, Simpson was woken up by DeFago's violent movements. DeFago was quaking with fear, and Simpson tried to calm him down. Suddenly, a strange, piercing voice echoed outside the tent, calling out DeFago's name. The voice was unlike anything Simpson had ever heard before, a mix of wind, crying, and something wild and powerful. DeFago sprang to his feet, rushed out of the tent, and vanished into the darkness, leaving Simpson behind. Simpson was left with a strange, pungent smell that he couldn't identify. He searched for DeFago but couldn't find him. With growing fear and confusion, Simpson realized he was alone in the wilderness. He made a futile attempt to find DeFago, running around and calling out his name. Eventually, he returned to the camp, exhausted and frightened. After regaining his composure, Simpson decided to make a thorough search for DeFago. He set out with food, matches, and a rifle, determined to find his missing companion. In the wilderness, DeFago, a skilled guide, disappeared mysteriously, leaving behind strange tracks and a haunting cry. Simpson, a young man, set out to find him, following the tracks that seemed to belong to an unknown creature. As he delved deeper into the forest, the tracks grew stranger, and Simpson began to feel a sense of unease and terror. The creature's tracks were enormous, and Dayfago's tracks seemed to be following it, as if he were being carried along. Simpson's fear turned to horror when he realized that Dayfago's tracks had changed, becoming identical to the creature's. The trail eventually ended, and Simpson heard Dayfago's distant cry, which sent him into a panic. He searched desperately, but to no avail. Eventually, he returned to his camp, haunted by the experience and the feeling of being pursued. In the Canadian wilderness, a young Scotsman named Simpson recounts his terrifying experience to his uncle, Dr. Cathcart, and friends Hank and Punk. Simpson had been on a hunting trip with guide Dayfago, who suddenly disappeared, leaving Simpson to find his way back to camp. Simpson describes how Dayfago became increasingly agitated, speaking of a Wendigo and exhibiting strange behavior. When Dayfago vanished, Simpson followed his trail, but it mysteriously stopped, and he heard a voice calling for help. Simpson's uncle, a doctor, listens skeptically, attributing Simpson's experiences to hallucinations brought on by loneliness, bewilderment, and terror. However, Simpson insists that what he saw and heard was real. The group decides to search for Dayfago, but after hours of searching, they find nothing. Fresh snow has covered all signs, and they reluctantly conclude that Dayfago has likely succumbed to the wilderness, driven mad by some unknown force. As they discuss Dayfago's fate, Hank reveals that local legend tells of Indians seeing the Wendigo along 50 Island water, which may have contributed to Dayfago's initial reluctance to hunt there. The group decides to wait and devote the next day to a systematic search, but it seems unlikely they will find Dayfago alive. In the midst of a freezing wilderness, 3 men, Simpson, Dr. Cathcart, and Hank, huddled around a fire, trying to shake off the eerie atmosphere that had settled over them. The conversation turned to the legend of the Wendigo, a monstrous creature said to roam the woods, calling out to its victims by name. As they spoke, the darkness seemed to close in around them, and the silence was oppressive. Dr. Cathcart explained that the Wendigo was a symbol of the call of the wild, which some people heard to their own destruction. Hank added that once you heard the call, you were doomed, and the creature's voice resembled the sounds of the forest. Simpson listened in horror as the 2 men described the Wendigo's powers, including its ability to burn its feet off and regrow new ones. As the night wore on, the tension grew, and Hank suddenly let out a blood-curdling yell, claiming that Dayfago, their missing companion, was nearby. In response, a faint cry echoed through the trees, and a figure dropped from the sky, landing with a thud on the frozen earth. The 3 men stood frozen in terror as the figure approached, its footsteps crunching through the snow. Finally, Dayfago emerged from the darkness, his face twisted and his eyes wild. He stumbled towards them, laughing maniacally, and Simpson felt a sense of horror wash over him. Hank and Dr. Cathcart sprang into action, trying to calm Dayfago down and tend to his wounds. But as they looked into his eyes, they saw something that chilled them to the bone. Dayfago was no longer himself, but a shadow of his former self, driven mad by the horrors he had faced in the wilderness. In the midst of a dark and eerie forest, a group of men, including Dr. Cathcart, his nephew Simpson, and guide Hank, gathered around a fire, where they encountered a ghastly and twisted figure claiming to be Dayfago. The figure's face was distorted, with loose skin and features drawn out of proportion, evoking a sense of horror and unease. Hank, overcome with emotion, shouted that the figure was not Dayfago, but an imposter. As the tension escalated, the figure began to speak in a faint, animal-like voice, claiming to have seen a terrifying entity known as the Wendigo. As the conversation continued, the figure's legs were revealed, showing dark, oddly shaped masses instead of feet. Dr. Cathcart quickly covered them, and the figure, with a malicious grin, spoke of its fiery, burning feet. Suddenly, a loud roar swept through the camp, and the figure disappeared into the darkness, leaving the men shaken and terrified. The rest of the night was filled with chaos and fear, as the men struggled to come to terms with what they had witnessed. Hank and Simpson were overcome with hysteria, while Dr. Cathcart fought to maintain control. As the night wore on, the men eventually fell asleep, exhausted and traumatized. The next morning, they packed up their camp and began their journey back to civilization. Though they tried to discuss what had happened, they were unable to make sense of the horrors they had witnessed. Simpson, a student of divinity, believed they had caught a glimpse of a prehistoric, monstrous force that lurked behind human souls. Dr. Cathcart, however, remained tight-lipped, refusing to discuss the details of the encounter. Upon their return to camp, they found Dayfago, the real one, who had been missing for days. He was emaciated, exhausted, and had lost all memory of his past life. His mind had been shattered, and he was left a broken, childlike shell of his former self. Dayfago's memory vanished, and before winter ended, he was gone, leaving behind only his empty shell. Punk, who was cleaning fish by the lake, saw Dayfago's weak figure returning to camp, accompanied by a strange smell. Frightened, Punk rushed back home, covering the 3-day journey in record time, driven by the terror of his people. He knew what had happened. Dayfago had encountered the Wendigo.